Hi, everybody, and welcome to our Braving Recovery community. I'm so happy that you're here tonight, and I want you to know that at the end of our talk, we're going to have some time for questions. And then tomorrow, you'll be getting an email, which I hope will be the beginning of many emails that are going to be by and from this community to continually inspire us, boost our motivation, and keep us walking this hard recovery path, because it is so hard sometimes. And I really hope that we can all support each other and use our unique experiences and our unique selves to really help each other get through. So this webinar series is designed to address life after treatment. My name is Shannon Kopp. I work at Eating Recovery Center as a national recovery advocate. So my passion is really spreading awareness about eating disorders and fighting the stigma. I also battled an eating disorder and went to treatment for it. And so I wanted to talk about what that's like and how hard it can be adjusting back into the real world after treatment, and some tools that I used during that time. And honestly, they're tools that I still use today. So tonight we're going to focus on coping with urges and triggers after treatment. And I think I'll just launch right into it. So I want to begin, oops, there we go. I want to begin by telling you a story about this dog named Stewie. So right after I got out of treatment, I was 22, living in San Diego, California, and somehow I got a job working at the San Diego Humane Society, which is one of the nicest and most innovative humane societies in the world. And around that time, a little puppy named Stewie, the dog that you're seeing right now, came into our care. Our humane investigations officers found him. He was being burned alive by his parents, his owners, I guess we'll call them. And thankfully, the humane investigators found him and brought Stewie into our care. And we were able to do a surgery on Stewie that's actually usually performed on human burn victims. And after the surgery, Stewie had to live in a little cage for a few weeks, actually. And the reason was that the burns had done so much damage that there were parts of his skin, and you can see it here, that were just raw pink, and the hair would never grow back there. And the skin was so tender and bright red, and it had to be wrapped in the bandages, and the bandages had to be changed, and he couldn't really move in this little kennel. Moving would hurt him further, so they had to keep him in this small, confined space. And day after day, we'd all take turns visiting with him, trying to comfort him. And I admired him immediately, because for all that he'd been through in his life, he would still squirm to the front of his cage and put that little nose you can see right through the bars. He wanted connection, and connection, I really think, is the most important thing in our recovery journey. And we'll get into that in a second. But he was just this incredibly resilient little puppy. And he was in this cage day after day with people comforting him, changing his bandages. And then came the day, weeks after this, that he finally, his skin had healed to the point where he could be adopted. And he could go out of that cage, out of that structure, without all the support he had gotten in our veterinary suite, onto the adoption floor. And for Stewie, that was a pretty smooth transition. He was thrilled to be in a bigger space. He played like any puppy would play. And, his story and the trauma he'd faced in his life was not really with him. It was there. There were times he was anxious. He remembered it in his body and in his mind, but not in the way we humans remember trauma. Our brains are different than animals, of course, and we don't have minds that are constantly animals don't have minds that are constantly taking them back to the trauma, replaying the experience, analyzing it, saying, I'm a terrible person because this happened, or because I'm doing this now, or why did this happen? An animal is always in the moment. And so when Stewie was on the adoption floor and when he got adopted, that transition was really smooth. And I was kind of in awe of him about how easily he was able to embrace this new life. after all he'd been through. And what Stewie went through in the veterinary suite, in that cage he was in day after day, is kind of like what it's like to be in treatment, right? We're just there in this confined space with all of our pain and trauma, all the things that we've been running from straight to the eating disorder for so long. We can't escape it now, because of the structure in place, and the daily meals and the support and the locked bathrooms and all the other things in place to keep our eating disorders away and out. It forces the pain and the memories and the emotions, good, bad, everything in between, to be right there, so close to us, almost like we're in a confined space that small too. And, the other thing about treatment is we're constantly being checked in on, and people know why we're there. We're not hiding our trauma or our pain or our eating disorder. We're there for a reason. And then when we discharge, we have to go out into the real world. And the real world isn't a world that speaks highly about emotional pain, about sadness, about struggle, about mental illness. Our world likes happy, shiny feelings. Our world likes happily ever after stories. Our world likes before and after pictures. We get messages from our society all the time that say, you don't need to struggle. Do this, do that. You can heal from this in 2 days, 1 day, 1 hour. We're surrounded by messages like this of instant gratification. And so when we leave a place where we're doing the hard emotional work moment after moment and we're facing our pain, for me, I found the transition out of that and into the real world so much more difficult than it was for Stewie. And the reason it was so much more difficult for me than for Stewie is, of course, because I have this brain of mine that is constantly analyzing my experience and telling me what to think about it. And when I discharged from treatment, I knew on an intellectual level that I didn't choose to have an eating disorder. I understood that. I understood that it was an illness that had to do with genetics. And I understood that it was an illness that had to do with brain chemistry, and it was an illness that has to do with the environment and trauma and so many different factors that honestly we're still researching and learning about. Eating disorder treatment has only been around for 20 to 30 years, but eating disorders have been around for a long time. And so I understood on an intellectual level that yes, I had a serious eating disorder, but in my heart, I felt shame about it. And I told myself a lot of stories about it. And that made my transition a lot harder when I went back to work, when I went, back into my friendships and my family life. I still had a lot of stories spinning in my mind. Stories like, maybe I was being a little dramatic and I didn't have this eating disorder. Maybe I don't have an eating disorder because I'm not thin enough to have an eating disorder. Maybe I should have never gotten an eating disorder to begin with. Yes, I had faced some trauma in my life. But when I thought about people in marginalized communities, people of color, disabled people, poor people, LGBTQ people, and I thought about what they had to go through every day to live in our society, I felt guilty. I thought to myself, there's goodness in your life. Why isn't that enough to keep you recovered? Why isn't that enough for you to get better? You shouldn't have any disorder. I blamed myself. I blamed myself for struggling when I got out of treatment. I blamed myself for having this illness. My mother, she blamed herself too, that her daughter had an illness. And when I speak at, family days, or when I speak to patients at ERC, they're often blaming themselves too. Why can't I get better? Why is this so hard? And in a way, the blame and the shame, it feels constructive, like at least we're doing something. But it's not. It just keeps us wrapped up in our heads, and it fuels the disease. And Stewie, when he got out of his treatment, he didn't have to deal with a mind like that. He didn't have to deal with shame, and he didn't have to deal with messages from a society that really likes instant gratification and is not a fan of the struggle. Our society likes easy things, and recovering from an eating disorder, in my opinion, is one of the hardest things any person can face in life. Recovery can be so hard, and yet it's so possible, and I believe that in my core. So I want to share with you, and this is a slide that just says we can't heal from something we don't believe is real. And I felt so much shame about my eating disorder that I couldn't talk about it honestly for a long time. And sometimes I convinced myself that it wasn't even real because it didn't look like the eating disorder we see in our society, right? I didn't match the description of what our society says an eating disorder is. And so I told myself, maybe it wasn't that bad. And the reason I'm sharing that with you is because when I got out of treatment, I didn't have my foundation in place. The shame had already crept in and said, you know what, you shouldn't be struggling this much. You've gotten the tools and treatment. You should be able to figure this out on your own. It's not a big deal. And so, I had a relapse prevention plan when I got out of treatment. It said to see a therapist twice a week, but I went once a week. And it said to see a dietitian, and I went once, and then I fired her. It said to see a psychiatrist, and I didn't do that until I had to. And then finally got on medication. It said to go to group therapy, and I didn't do that either until it got hard enough. So the first thing I want to say tonight is, if I could go back in time 10 years ago, I wish that I could have a little bit more compassion around all that shame I felt and all that stigma that was with me, and faced the reality that life after treatment is hard and we need support. And unfortunately, I kind of had to learn the hard way and not have a lot of support, not have a strong foundation in place, and then struggle and struggle and then build that foundation. But we don't have to do that. Right now, tonight even, we can start building our foundation. We can make sure that we have a therapist that we trust and connect with. And that's not always an easy thing to find. My first therapist was this male marriage counselor that told me to drink water when I wanted to binge. Clearly, the guy didn't know what I was dealing with. If I could have just drank water, obviously I would have done that and I wouldn't have a full-blown eating disorder. And when I say eating disorder, I struggled mainly with bulimia, but I also struggled with binge eating disorder at times and restriction. So I relate to the many different forms eating disorders take in people's lives. And I eventually, because I kept relapsing and because I kept struggling, got that therapist. I searched for her and I found a therapist that I would work with for many years, actually. And I found a dietitian that I trusted and a psychiatrist and group therapy. And those were really the pillars of my recovery. So before we talk about specific tools you can use for moments when in triggering situations or when urges are right there with you and the eating disorder is calling your name, it's good every now and then, maybe even weekly, to just check your foundation, make sure those pillars are in place. Because even though recovery is possible, I just don't think it's possible to do on our own. We need help. So maybe tonight, if you can just do kind of a spot check, where am I with my foundation? Is it in place? So I want to move on now to talk about coping skills. And the first one I want to talk about is really connection. And the San Diego Humane Society, which is where I started working when I discharged from treatment, was really an amazing place. And it was a really frustrating time for me because I'm a big animal lover. And there were all these animals, loving dogs and cats and horses and rabbits and guinea pigs right outside the door. But there was also break rooms at the Humane Society and bathrooms, and I kept turning to my eating disorder in this place where I was surrounded by so much love and support and honestly my passion. And I had wished so badly that my job situation, my passion would be enough to stop my relapsing, but it wasn't. But one of the things I learned was vital to stopping the relapse cycle was connection. And I just want to share with you a quick story. I have lots of animal stories. I've worked in animal welfare for 10 years now. And one time at a shelter I was working with, and if you're looking at the PowerPoint, you can see a picture of me with a dog named Ranger. And Ranger was a 12-year-old shepherd. And at the time, there was another 12-year-old shepherd in our care, and her name was Sheba. And she, unfortunately, had come to the Humane Society after her owner had passed away. And dogs are emotional beings, and she felt depressed, and she would just lay in her kennel day after day, and she wouldn't get up, and she wouldn't eat, and she wouldn't go for walks. She wouldn't do anything. And we tried all these different things. We tried different food. We tried different leashes. We tried different people. But this dog could not get up until one day a volunteer was walking Ranger by Sheba's kennel. And she saw him and they connected in some kind of way. And she stood up for the first time. And they ended up going on a walk together. And that was her first time going for a walk. And then they ended up eating together. And then they started kenneling together. And eventually they were adopted together. And I will never completely understand it, but Sheba obviously felt a really profound and special connection with Ranger. Maybe it was something about the fact that they were the same age, the same kind of dog. Maybe he just made her feel safe in a way that people couldn't. So I think in our recovery process, we have to find our Rangers. We have to find the people that make us safe and that we connect with on a really profound level. And I think the first people that come to mind for me are other people that have walked this journey, other people that have battled eating disorders or are currently battling eating disorders. They can help us in a way no one else can because they can understand it through personal experience in a way no one else can. And our connection with those people is important. And that's why when we started talking about doing this webinar series, I really wanted to have an email chain in between for all of us so that we can connect on a weekly basis and share what we're going through, what we're experiencing, how we're using the tools. And we'll get into more details with that later. But the power of connecting with another alumni or another person who knows what it's like to battle an eating disorder, to maybe to go to treatment, to discharge from treatment. That is important. And I had a couple people I knew. One friend was an alum from the program I went to. And it was easier in my moments of crisis to reach out and text her than it was to text anybody else. And so just identifying in your mind, who are my Rangers? Who are my people that I can turn to when things get tough? Who will understand? It could be also a family member or a dear friend, and just saying to them ahead of time, you know what, this week might be a tough week for me. Would it be okay if I just texted you if I was, having a moment of struggle? Because our disease thrives in isolation. And my friend from my program, some friends that I met through the 12 steps, they became key for me because it was easy. And for some reason, I could not often pick up the phone and call them, but I could text them. And just doing that, just knowing I had let the truth out to one person that could understand, it was powerful. And just like Ranger did one, Sheba and Ranger did one meal at a time, one walk at a time. Then they went to kenneling together. Then they went and were adopted together. We walk this journey of recovery one step at a time with each other. And so You may find people in a spiritual community or in a yoga group, the 12 steps, but definitely this alumni community. I'm really hoping that we can come together in between these webinars and support each other. Another important connection is with your treatment team, making sure that it's authentic, making sure that it feels true in your heart. I knew the second that therapist said, "Why don't you drink water the next time you want to binge?" that this was not the person I should be meeting with every week to talk about an eating disorder that wanted me dead. To find coping skills and tools to survive that. That therapist was not the right fit for me, but I found someone. And so keep trying. If you haven't found that therapist yet, keep trying. I promise someone is out there for you. So I'm going to talk about some other specific coping skills I practiced right after treatment. And one of them was writing a note from my up self to my down self, which sounds a little bit confusing. So let me explain. I am a person still today. I go through a lot of highs and lows and ups and downs every day. We all do. But I think, a lot of us who struggle with an eating disorder, we're extremely sensitive people and we feel things really deeply. And that's a gift sometimes. And sometimes it can make life really hard. And so my journey after treatment was very up. Some days I was like, yes, I can do this. I can recover. I can have a different life. And some days it was just like, why am I even trying? This is too hard. And I would have a down day or a down moment. And my therapist encouraged me to write a note to myself, and this is an example of it, in that moment, and bring it with me to therapy. Because I needed to constantly, I was fighting against denial. I was fighting against stigma and shame. And the voices in my head that were saying, you know what, do you really need to see your therapist twice a week? Do you really need to go to this group therapy? Do you really need this medication? And on and on and on. And so if I was having a down moment, writing exactly kind of what was going on, what thoughts I was having, and bringing it to treatment, it helped me to and it helped my therapist, I believe, to guide the conversation with the thoughts that were really harming me and keeping me from recovery. And so when those thoughts came again, I had a little bit more direction and guidance. And also some acceptance, because some days I would go into therapy and be like, you know what, I'm doing great. And I was some days, but I would forget that just 4 days earlier, I was on the verge of relapse and what that felt like. It's amazing how different 24 hours can make. And so these notes kept me connected to the part of myself that was struggling and needed support. And then I would bring that to my support team. And it helped us to focus. Another thing I'm going to talk about is keeping it simple, or the power of one. I'm going to tell you another dog story because I obviously love dog stories. And if you're not an animal person, don't worry. The other webinars probably won't have as many animal stories. And what are animals for me might be yoga for you, or music, or art, or the guitar, whatever your soul passion is. So I've found, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, how important to my recovery process discovering my soul passion was and is in my life. So that's why dogs keep coming up. They're my soul passion. So I want to tell you, this is my dog, Bella, you're seeing in the slide right here. And unfortunately, when Bella was a couple years old, she was hit by a car. And thankfully, she was in veterinary care for a few days, and her legs had some bandages on them. And after the whole traumatic ordeal, when I brought her home and I opened the door to her house and I set her down on the floor, I was amazed because she just gently, quietly walked straight to this patch of sunlight that was on the carpet in our home by the window. It was maybe like this big. And she laid there. She walked right to that warm patch of light and just laid there. It was simple. And I remember looking at her and thinking, gosh, I wish self-care could be that simple and easy for me. But again, animals do not have human brains. And what happens for me is after I go through something challenging or struggling, or I just have a rough day and I walk in the door to my house, my brain is spinning. And I know of a lot of different things I can maybe do. I'm full of intellectual knowledge about maybe what I can do to feel better. And I think, gosh, I could go to a yoga class, or maybe, but then I think, oh God, but then I got to get changed, and that's like an hour. And then I think, well, maybe I could call somebody, but I don't know. And I spin and I spin and I spin. And self-care becomes this really complicated, kind of far away, tiring, exhausting thing that I don't really want to do. It's hard to explain, but it just feels like so much effort sometimes. And I think, it can be exhausting battling a mental illness. And so for me, keeping things very simple has been key, and doing things in small increments has also been really helpful. So going back to the simplicity of Bella just walking through the door after the hardest experience of her life and laying right down in that patch of sunlight. My therapist asked me one day, well, you have a bunch of patches of sunlight in your life. There are a bunch of things you can do when you walk in the door after work. And that was a very vulnerable time for me. Things that I could do to experience some warmth and healing and comfort rather than go straight to the kitchen. So a few of those things. So just imagine right now that you've had a rough day and you're walking into the door of your apartment or your house, and there's this urge, your eating disorder is calling your name. What can you do right then and there to interrupt the behavior? So one thing that my therapist taught me was lion's breath. So you just take a deep inhale through your nose. And a deep, audible exhale through your mouth. So I would often come home, and if I could remember, I would do that walking in the door. Sometimes I do that today, just to remind myself that the world is not here in my head with all my worries and problems. It's in my body. It's in this moment, in this breath. That's where life happens. When urges would be strong at work, going outside for 1 minute, not to go for a walk, not to take, an hour, but a minute, just to go sit under a tree. It was amazing if I could get myself to do that, what a shift that would make. And how the voices saying to binge or to engage in the eating disorder this way, if I could just interrupt it with a minute of time outdoors, it helped. One yoga pose. This is something I didn't do back then because I didn't do yoga in the early recovery, but I tend to do it now. I have a 1-year-old son and life is hectic, and sometimes I don't have time to go to a full yoga class, but I can do one pose. And it helps to ground and to center me. A 1-minute mantra. You can repeat a phrase that's most comforting to you. Peace or love or be here now. Intentionally for 1 minute to stop the incessant flow of thought. Writing one sentence in your journal, or sending one text, or doing 1 minute of grounding, which for me, and we'll get into this in a little bit, I often ground myself by just closing my eyes and imagining my feet sinking 10 feet into the earth and feeling my feet on the ground and trying to be aware of that, how solid the ground feels beneath me, feeling like I'm rooted in the ground. It's amazing that all of these things only take 1 minute, and yet they can make a really powerful shift in our day. So the power of one, or finding your patches of sunlight, I hope some of that might be useful for you. So listening to your inner guide and your intuition. Triggers. All of us have unique lives, unique eating disorders, unique triggers. And we can know our triggers intellectually. Sometimes we can write them out, and And sometimes it can be hard to honor kind of on a heart level or a soul level the damage that happens when we ignore our triggers or we don't put plans in place or honor our intuition, our inner guide when it comes to triggers. They seem like little things, but they can turn into big problems if we just don't pay attention to them. So I just want to share with you a few quick stories that happened after treatment in which I had a bit of intuition and I didn't listen to it, and how that impacted my recovery. So a few of my triggers: if I'm tired, if I don't get enough sleep, if I'm really hungry, skipping meals, if I talk to my dad who is an alcoholic and abusive, if I ate in front of social media wasn't really around back then, but social media, the internet, the television. If I was alone at night with a lot of binge foods in my kitchen. And then in peer pressure situations and emotionally charged work situations. Those were all really hard for me to deal with. And, the first thought that came to mind would be, I need to eat. I need to binge. I need to engage with my eating disorder. And so there was one time where one of my best friends was having a party. She had just moved to California, and my plan was to go there for an hour or two and then come home, go to bed, and get enough sleep for the next day. I was in a fragile place with my recovery. It was all about trying to stick to my routine, trying to stick to my meal plan. And yet when I was at this party, my friend was just like, can you please just sleep over? Can't you be like how you used to be? You were so fun back in high school and college. Can't you just, stay the night? And I'm here. I miss you. And a voice inside said, no, go home. Go home. Get to bed. Have your breakfast in the morning, continue on this path of recovery. But then there was the people pleasing part of me, and then the part of me that just was sick of recovery a little bit. And so I stayed over and I got really little sleep. And I woke up the next day and I went home and I felt completely off track, and I relapsed that day. Didn't honor my intuition. Another example, there's a picture of me here. This is from when I was working at another time in my life at an animal shelter that was very different from the San Diego Humane Society, and it was very intense, very emotionally intense, a really sad place. And it was too much for me, and a voice kept saying, you need to work somewhere else. You need to help animals somewhere else. But I didn't want to, whether it was my pride or whatever. And I relapsed into a bout of depression. And it took a lot for me to get out of that. And I eventually did find another place to work with animals that was less triggering for me. But when I look back on the many times I relapsed over the 10 years I dealt with an eating disorder, gosh, dealt feels like such a stupid word. It's not something to deal with. It's something we have to fight against, something we have to recover from, something that is just so tough sometimes and yet so possible to recover from. So during the 10 years I was in the eating disorder, trying to get out, relapsing, I would look back at the relapses with my therapist and I would see so clearly there was that inner voice saying, whispering sometimes to keep me on the recovery path. So I started working with my therapist on ways to get that intuition, that inner guide, that inner voice, that recovery voice louder or more present, or how could I become more aware of it in the moments I needed to. Sometimes those power of one exercises, the lion's breath or the mantra meditation, would just help me. sometimes just texting someone, like if I would have texted someone when I was at that party, one of my alumni friends, someone from 12-step meetings, they would have understood. They would have said, nothing matters more than your recovery. Go home. But I didn't. One way that my therapist and I, because I just wasn't sure what my recovery voice or intuition was half the time, or if it was even there. And so she had me keep a self-compassion journal, and I would write a note to myself in the morning and a note to myself at night sometimes. And the morning note would be a note to myself that I'd write to my 5-year-old self, or no, I'd write to my 1-year-old son now. It was with that voice of love and acceptance and patience. And so I would write a note to myself in the morning and a note to myself at night. And then I had crisis compassion notes. So a note to myself as if I was a 5-year-old little girl in that moment when I'm not wanting to let my friend down, but I really need to leave the party, or I'm not wanting to let these animals down, but I'm really struggling and need to take care of my mental health. Writing compassion notes to myself helped me to uncover that inner wisdom. And so I do it a lot, and I still keep compassion journals now. It really helps to guide me. Quickly, I just want to go over a set-aside mantra. So a lot of times in my recovery, I was faced with a situation that hadn't worked in the past. So it was really hard after that one therapy appointment. I had to go and keep an open mind, or even entertain the idea of seeing another therapist. It just felt like, well, that didn't work in the past. Why is it going to work with this person? Or, breakfast yesterday didn't work out. It sucked. Why am I going to have a good breakfast today? This group therapy thing I hated, so why try this group therapy? And on and on and on. And what happened for me is just my past experiences were kind of closing the door to opportunities in the now to heal, because I thought if this kind of thing didn't work in the past, it's not going to work now, it's never going to work. That black or white, all or nothing thinking. The same thinking that would be like when I would walk in the door after a work day and think of yoga as, well, if you're going to do yoga, you got to do an hour-long class. If you're going to meditate, you got to sit with your eyes closed for 20 minutes. Finding the gray, finding the 1-minute solution, setting aside what our black and white, all or nothing thinking minds think they know, and opening ourselves to a present experience. So the mantra, and I'll say this today, even when I'm entering a meeting, or I'm going into my son's daycare, or whatever the situation is, the universe, please help me to set aside everything I think I know for an open mind and a new experience with my son's daycare, this meal, this therapist, this class. I try to literally sometimes close my eyes and imagine just taking this head of mine and putting it over there and just trying to live right here in the now. It's helpful to me. A tool I sometimes use to manage anxiety is called chunking. A friend shared this with me. And essentially, if you wake up one day and we'll just use work as an example, but maybe it's treatment, maybe it's a doctor appointment, maybe it's a retreat or an event you're going to. I'll just use the example of work. You wake up and you think, I can't go to work today. You decide from then on you're handling the day in 15-minute chunks. So you tell yourself, you almost trick yourself, and I've done this several times. I can't go to work today. Okay, I'm not going to go to work, but I'm going to take a shower and put my clothes on. That's all I'm going to do. Because the day itself, the idea of going to work feels so overwhelming, but I'm not doing that. I'm just going to shower and put some clothes on. And then after that, I say, okay, I'm not going to work, but I will take my dog for a walk. And then after the walk, okay, I'm not going to work, but I'll eat some breakfast. And then I'm not going to work, but I will get in the car. I'm just going to pull into the parking lot and listen to my favorite song. I'm just going to go inside and say hi to a coworker. And you take your day in 15-minute chunks. So you keep staying in action. So you get out of bed. And it's once the body gets moving and into the day, eventually for me, it starts flowing. But when I have so much anxiety about just the big idea of work, I just have to set that idea aside and take it 15 minutes at a time, chunk my day. That helps me today, and it helped me years ago. Chunking, we call it. There's probably a better name for it. But my friend recently shared about it with me, and I thought it was worth mentioning here. Grounding. So there's grounding journaling you can do, grounding meditations. One friend shared with me a quick one she does is called 5-4-3-2-1. So you can do this, and I would do it in a journal. Look around and name 5 things you see. Name 4 things you feel, internally or externally. So it could be, the coolness of the air, or it could be something you're feeling in your heart, maybe anxiety or sadness or joy. Name 3 things you currently hear. Name 2 things you smell. Name 1 thing you can taste at the moment. And I think no matter what kind of eating disorder we struggle with, it lives in the mind. And it's constantly talking at us, telling us who we are and who we're not, and what we should eat and what we shouldn't, and on and on and on. And so to ground ourselves and to be in our bodies, which can be a real frightening thing for some of us, it was for me, but if we can do that, we can kind of get some space around the loud voice of the eating disorder. And what recovery is all about, of course, is being able to, in the beginning, hear the voice of the eating disorder and disobey. The eating disorder says, you're not eating breakfast, and you hear it, and yet you still eat breakfast. You have some space around it. It's not your entire awareness. So to take awareness from our heads and put it into the ground, put it into this moment where we are, it's a powerful, powerful practice. And it's helped me not only with my eating disorder, but with depression, and most recently, as of a year ago, with postpartum depression. Grounding, I can't overstate how important it's been for me. I'm wearing my grounding necklace. It's something that my husband gave me a long time ago. Actually, when I went a year free of eating disorder behaviors for the first time. And so just holding it is a reminder to me to ground myself when my head gets really loud and busy. There's lots of other grounding objects you can use: silly putty, slinkies, worry stones. So if you haven't tried that, I definitely suggest it. Grounding objects and trigger spots. So this is a picture of my journal under my pillow on my bed. And places that were just triggering for me, or where I often found myself battling with the voice of Ed, it would be in the kitchen, obviously. Then at night, when I couldn't fall asleep, I just want to get up and go to the kitchen. And then at work, when I would get stressed out. So my therapist suggested keeping journals in the kitchen. So I had one right by my fridge on the counter. I had one by my bed, and I had one in my desk. And again, applying that idea of keeping recovery simple and doable. The goal would be to just write down a word, or to just scribble on the page, or to just move from thinking to the observer and start jotting down things I observed in the room. And basically the idea was just interrupt that constant stream of thought that's urging you towards the eating disorder. Interrupt it. And so having a journal physically there made it a little bit easier. And it didn't always work, but sometimes it did. Sometimes I would literally be going to the kitchen, and I would be walking towards the fridge, and I would see my journal next to the fridge, and I would just scribble on my journal, and I would do it until I felt like I could walk out of the kitchen. That really helped me. So I wanted to share it with you guys. I just also want to mention co-occurring disorders, since many of us struggle with them, whether it's substance use or anxiety or depression or PTSD or OCD. For me, depression has been a part of my life. And while some coping skills and things I've done in my eating disorder recovery helped, there's other things that haven't. So I just want to emphasize the importance of, if you're struggling with co-occurring issues, to continue seeking treatment for that. Specific treatment for my depression, for example, medication for my depression was really important. Okay, and we're coming to the end here. I want to talk about journaling. I'm leaving you guys with 2 exercises here, and my hope is that you guys will give one of them a try and maybe share it with this group. And I'm going to explain how it works. But first, I'll go over the journaling exercise. So one is writing a letter to your inner child, writing a letter to yourself as a child, maybe at 4 or 5 years old. What would you tell that person? What would you tell her about who she is and what she values and what her life is? Another way to think about it is going back to the self-compassion journal. So if you have a journal just designated for compassion, because so many of us were so good at having compassion for others, right? Our fellow eating disorder warriors on this path, we have so much compassion for our friends. We want them to recover. We believe they can recover. We have patience for them on their journey. But then when it comes to ourselves, we make one mistake and we're so hard on ourselves. So a journal just for compassion, and I think of compassion as that voice of that you would have for yourself as a child, or maybe the way your dog sees you, or maybe the way your grandmother sees you. Just a perspective that's full of love and acceptance and patience. And so if you have a morning compassion note, you can think about what am I doing today? Where can I bring compassion in? And then if you have an evening compassion note, you can think about, where could I have shown more compassion for myself today? And can I do it now? What do I love about myself? Where was I brave? Where did I take steps towards recovery? And then the crisis compassion note. What would you tell your 5-year-old self right now? Because he or she is in you right now. So speaking to that 5-year-old inside. So one of the journaling exercises is just writing a note to your inner child. All the ages we've ever been are inside us. So locating that inner 4-year-old, that inner 5-year-old, that inner 6-year-old that's still able to find so much joy in life and doesn't have such heavy, persistent thinking. Finding that self and writing a note to him or her. Another journaling exercise you can try is a day without an eating disorder. And maybe if that's too hard to imagine, just a minute or a moment without an eating disorder. So you write about a day without your eating disorder. What might you do or say or think? How would your routine be different? What would your relationships be like? What would you think in the morning? And what would you do in the evening? And then maybe you can incorporate one of those activities into your week. So this is what I'm thinking, guys. All of us here have a common bond. We have the unique experience of having battled an eating disorder, having gone to treatment or seeking treatment in some form and trying to continue on the path of recovery. And we can understand each other in a way that even our therapists or our family members or loved ones can't. So what I'm envisioning is that you guys can share with me. You can email bravingrecovery@eatingrecovery.com, and you're going to get an email tomorrow all about this with your experiences, because I'm just one person and every eating disorder is different. Every person is different. Every path to recovery is different. And these are just things that helped me with triggers and urges. But I'd love for you to email bravingrecovery@eatingrecovery.com and share with me the tools you use. Or maybe you can share if any of these tools feel helpful, how you're practicing them or an experience you've had with them. And you'll email that to Braving Recovery. And then every week, I'm hoping if we get enough content, an email will arrive in your inbox. I'll take together what everybody emails me and I'll put it into an email, and you'll get it every Friday. And it'll be an email for our group, by our group, about how we're braving recovery after treatment, how we're getting through the different tools that we're using, and maybe some samples of them. So these journaling exercises, if you feel comfortable and want to share it with the group, your letter to your inner child, the day without an eating disorder, email that to me so we can share it. Because what helped me more than anything after treatment was the feeling that I wasn't alone in this. Eating disorders thrive in isolation, but we heal when we connect with each other. And we have a really special connection because we're all going through this personally, or we've gone through it personally. So whether you're interested in trying some of the techniques or just doing a full-blown journal entry or sending a picture of your art therapy, please send it and participate if you'd like. You also don't have to participate, and you can just receive the emails each week and let them lift you up and help you to know that you're not alone. So we've talked a lot about some heavy things tonight, triggers and urges. That's heavy, it's emotional, it's hard. So I went to a yoga class today, and it reminded me, I picked up this card, and everybody picked a card before the class started, and it said, "Happiness is my birthright." And I'm, as someone that struggled with depression, as someone that struggled with an eating disorder for a long time, as someone that's grew up in an alcoholic home, happiness is a little bit uncomfortable for me. I'm more comfortable in the struggle. I'm more comfortable in the fight. And we are in the fight of our lives with an eating disorder, but it doesn't mean it has to all be so heavy and dark, and it especially doesn't have to be that way if we don't do it alone. And so it just occurred to me today in yoga how much joy plays a role in recovery, finding our joy, the unique things that bring us joy. When I left treatment, shelter dogs were not on my relapse prevention plan, but I can't imagine how I would have ever recovered if not for my emotional support animal and shelter dogs as part of the recovery process. So I think an important way to fight off triggers and urges is to simply do some experimenting and figuring out what brings us joy. The eating disorder hates joy, hates it. So for me, that was spending time with shelter dogs. That was being outside in nature. Recently with the postpartum, yoga has brought me a lot of joy and helped me to recover from that. Dancing for me, I mean like silly, stupid dancing in front of the mirror at home, just to wake myself up out of the seriousness that can be my awareness sometimes. If you're not sure where to begin with finding some joy, maybe you have a memory of something you loved as a child. That's how I found my way back to animals. I loved them as a kid before the eating disorder started, and I love them now. And they continue to help and support me. So I want to end by thanking you all for being here tonight. I can't tell you how much it means to me, and how much I wished I had something like this after I discharged. I'm hoping that we can come together on this Braving Recovery email chain and really continue to support each other in between the webinars that we're going to be having. And also that maybe tonight you can give some thought to your soul passions and how you can incorporate those in your life a little bit more. I just really want to thank you guys for being here tonight. It means so much to me. And recovering from an eating disorder is a brave, courageous, hard path, and we can't do it alone. So I'm really hoping that you gained some valuable tools tonight and that we can come together as a community and continue sharing our tools and experiences and hope with each other. So good night, everybody. Signing off.